Hello, class, and welcome to They Don't Teach That with Jay Cobley. I'm your host, Jay Cobley, and today we're talking about the man who is most commonly referred to as the father of the American Navy. What do you get when you cross an angry Scotsman, a brand new nation, and a handful of pirate tactics? You guessed it, we're talking John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones, born John Paul, was actually born in Scotland in 1747, and his childhood was mostly uneventful until he turned 13, when his sailing career would begin. See, he actually signed up to sail out of Whitehaven, a northern county of England, on the Friendship, captained by Benson. As his apprentice, he would learn many of the traits and skills that he would then use later in his maritime career. See, around that time was also when John Paul's brother, William, would settle in Fredericksburg and marry. Now, he'll become important later on. But at the same time, and over those years from when he began his sailing career, John Paul actually sailed on several different ships and gained the title of third mate on one of them, the King George, and first mate on the Two Friends at the age of 19. He left that position in 1768 when they made port in Jamaica, and they found passage back to Scotland on his own. And now's when things get a little confusing. See, the call of the sea would call John Paul back to it, and he would eventually find himself on the ship known as John. Yeah, John sailed on John. I don't know what else to say. But here's where it gets even weirder. Since the captain of the ship and the ranking mate below him both died of disease on the ship, well, panic kind of ensued, and John Paul was able to command and navigate the ship back to port on his own, where the very, very happy owners of the ship actually made him the master of the ship, the commander, and made him the primary captain of the ship, giving him even 10% of the cargo that he would be transporting. During the second voyage in 1770, as the captain of the John, he kind of made some harsh decisions, one of which was having one of the men on the ship flogged after he attempted to stage a mutiny over the fact that he didn't feel he got paid enough. This got called into question after the fact because the man died on the ship because of a disease. The flogging just didn't help. And so John Paul was actually arrested and sentenced for murder. But he would make bail and be back on the shipping and back at sea in a matter of time. See, the main issue was that sailor that died on his command that he had flogged was actually an adventurer, not a typical sailor. He came from a prominent family of wealth in Scotland, and so when he was able to be released on bail, the guards kind of told him, you need to go, and you should probably change your name along the way. And he agreed. He hopped on the first boat he could get passage on, which just so happened to be one that he would command, that was a British ship leaving for the New World. See, while he was in command of that ship, the Betsy, he had another incident where he had another crewmate flogged. And in case you guys aren't aware of what flogging is, it is being whipped with one of these nasty guys, which doesn't look like it tickles. But this guy also died, and he was actually strung through with the sword. He was also attempting a mutiny over the same thing as last time. This guy didn't feel he got paid enough, and when it came to the discussion, most of the authorities have said that he acted in self-defense, which he kind of had to take another step back because he had now killed two different members of his crew, both for the same thing. And that doesn't look good on his reputation. See, the thing is, too, years later, Benny Frankman here would actually say that he had talked to John Paul about it, and John Paul had told him it was self-defense based on the story. So here's where his story gets fuzzy. We don't have a lot of information about what happened around this time, but what we do know is after that whole sword incident, he ended up settling somewhere in Fredericksburg because he was going to take over his brother's estate, who had just died, and finalize and clear up a lot of the paperwork that was necessary there, and attempt a life there, being that his home in Scotland was now a no-go. So basically settling down, it wasn't really clear whether or not he just joined out of the political fervor of the times, or if he just wanted to be a sailor again, or what, but he would eventually sign up with the First Continental Navy. What we do know of this time was that he was elected to the Philosophical Society of Philadelphia in 1774, shortly after he would then sign up with the Continental Navy in 1775. Being that the Navy was still in its infancy, it was in desperate need of men and ships, and it would just so happen that the Continental Congress would assign John Paul Jones his first ship at the title of First Lieutenant of the newly converted 24-gun frigate, the USS Alfred. Our Batman now has his Alfred. And with that, he sailed from the Delaware River to the new Continental Navy's maiden cruise, and was even taken the honor in hoisting the first Grand Union flag. See? This flag. Super cool. See, they were supposed to just cruise the coastline of the American colonies, but Commodore Hopkins decided, let's go invade Jamaica! And so they did. They cruised down to Jamaica, attacked a settlement where they knew where a large assortment of British arms and munitions and military gear and supply were, and raided it, took it all on their ships, and headed back home. After that, John Paul Jones was assigned to be in command of the USS Providence. And under his command, the ship had several important roles, including transporting troops, shipping of supplies, and even escorting convoys of men. And he was even able to assist another ship from attack by the HMS Cerberus, which was full of military provisions that they were easily able to privatize and bring back to the colonies, which is kind of cool. But this would also start the whole pirate tactics of John Paul Jones's career. See, while John Paul Jones was doing his own thing, he was also getting into it with the high command. And the authority just didn't really vibe with what he was putting down. And this actually reached new heights when he returned to Boston. See, the guy who led the attack down in the Bahamas, Commodore Hopkins, and our boy started beefing. John Paul Jones thought that Hopkins was a detriment and to the advancement. He just didn't think that Hopkins had what it took to actually take the fight to the enemy, and kind of just thought of him as just like a worm, basically. But Hopkins thought the opposite to John Paul Jones. He thought he was too brash and too excitable. So they didn't really like each other because they were as diametrically opposed as it kind of gets. But a lot of this would change after John Paul Jones would be assigned a new command, a command over the USS Ranger. A smaller ship and a smaller crew, but wow, we're gonna get into some weirdness. Originally, he was actually promised a different ship, and after taking the Ranger to France, where the ship was supposed to be, where he was supposed to take the command of, a ship by the name of the Indian. See, this ship was actually being made in Amsterdam, but the British kept pressuring the Amsterdam shipwrights to not sell it to America and pushing other countries to buy it instead. So France bought it, and France gave it to us. But it wasn't there by the time John Paul Jones had got there, and so he kind of lost it in this really weird roundabout kind of sort of way. And see, at the same time, John Paul Jones in France with the French delegate at the time, Benny Frankman, they became really good friends. They became a great influence upon one another, and we are doing our next historical figure is going to be Benny Frankman. Missed a $100 bill, y'all. For sure. The USS Ranger was also the first American vessel to be saluted by the French ever. First American vessel. Really kind of cool. John Paul Jones, y'all. Now is when John Paul Jones' story gets crazy. See, he convinces his men to stage an attack against Whitehaven, where he started his sailing career. And after a series of successful attacks on British merchant vessels, mostly privatizing their gear, their food, their clothing, and any stocks and goods that they carried, this guy decided to attack it. And although they tried, the air and the wind just wouldn't let them. The strong winds wouldn't let them get anywhere near Whitehaven. So they ended up hearing about this other ship that was docked over in Ireland from one of these merchant vessels that they had attacked. So, on April 20th, they discovered the ship and tried to capture the Royal Naval ship, the warship HMS Drake. And it was anchored off the coast of Ireland, like the merchant had said, the little captured sailor boy. And John Paul Jones knew he could take it, and so he originally planned this attack out for the middle of the day, but his sailors weren't about it, and they were not trying to fight in the middle of the day in broad daylight with their small ship versus a warship. So, they waited. The problem is in waiting, the sailor that was supposed to drop the anchor was drunk, missed his mark, and they actually had to cut their anchor loose and run away because the Drake had actually been slightly more reinforced than they had expected. And since they missed their mark completely for the clean shot, they really had no choice but to run away. After that, they attempted a second raid on Whitehaven. And in this one, John Paul Jones, as well as 2 boats and 15 men, decided they would lead a midnight assault on the town. And for the most part, this did work. They successfully destroyed the sentries and stopped any artillery or cannon fire to be shot back at them upon their escape. But they actually ran out of a lot of their, lantern fluid, and so they needed to find a second source. So they ended up going and breaking into a local pub. But the sailors decided, hey, we haven't had a drink in a while, so they got drunk and partied in the pub until almost morning, where they had enough alcohol left over to try to light up one of the ships, which they did successfully do. However, it was at break of day, so there were people walking around, just doing their thing, getting ready for their day, seeing this fire out in their bay. So, being reasonable people, being aware of what they needed to do, they started firing off the, fire sirens, and people started flocking to the ship to put out the fire, which they were successful in doing, stopping a massive burn of the entire bay. But John Paul Jones and his crew got away because they were able to destroy the guns. And that was it. So, time for round 2 on the Drake. But not before the successful kidnapping and ransom of an Earl of Scotland. Specifically, the 4th Earl of Selkirk, Dunbar Douglas. See, the reasoning was John Paul Jones had nothing to show for his work. He had an unsuccessful raid on Whitehaven, he had an unsuccessful attack on the warship HMS Drake, and really all he had to show for his work were basic goods. He really didn't have much to show for anything, and so he was like, okay, the Earl of Selkirk is right on the coast. We can kidnap him in the night and hold him for ransom against his family, and it'll be a great win and something that we can hold over the British. So they successfully did that, but after the negotiations had all settled, they only left with this small silver family heirloom platter that is meant to be hung above a mantelpiece. It's just a coat of arms or a sign of status. And so they stole that, which would later go up for auction in France after the war, and being the gentleman that John Paul Jones actually was, he bought it at auction and returned it to the 4th Earl as a kind of apology. Which is kind of cool on his part. Man had some straight honor. After this, John Paul Jones decided that he needed to give the Drake another try. And by heading back for another assault, they were actually able to find a recon boat with some sailors on it beforehand. Taking them into custody, they asked them a bunch of questions and got some information, including the information that the HMS Drake had been heavily reinforced since the first attack. Knowing about this trap ahead of time led up to an amazing battle of about an hour long that cost the Drake its captain. So the men eventually would surrender the ship over to John Paul Jones's men and to John Paul Jones himself. So John Paul Jones, I love saying his name, put one of his lieutenants in charge of the ship. By putting that lieutenant in charge of the ship and in command of the ship, they were going to sail it back to France. But John Paul Jones, seeing a ship off in the distance, decided, I'm going to chase it! And ran off after the other ship while the Drake made its way back to France. So John Paul Jones got really mad at the guy who, did his job and tried to court-martial him, which would actually go horribly against him. It wouldn't get put through at all, and John Adams would even be like, no, bro, chill. So our boy, John Paul Jones, is now officially made captain. He is put in charge of the USS Bohm Richard in 1779, an old merchant ship that was refit for war. Bohm Richard was actually given to us by a French business magnate named Jacques d'Antienne Larrey as part of the invasion fleet that approached England with the aid of the Spanish and French vessels. John Paul Jones provided a division by heading towards Ireland with a 5-ship squadron, including the USS Alliance, the USS Pallas, the USS Vengeance. I imagine this being like the most heavy metal ship ever, just like all the crew with mohawks and leather jackets and spiked wristbands and just cranking out the cannibal corpse as they get ready to raid England. Yeah. And the Le Chef. He was also accompanied by 2 privateers, though one of these privateers would leave due to differences with John Paul. The English forces gave chase to the squad, which kind of led right into the trap that John Paul was setting them up for anyways by diverting them in one direction, and he just kept leading them north towards Scotland and the North Sea. But that's also when he started having some issues on the vessels again, this time with insubordination. Though it wasn't with anyone in his crew, it was actually with another squad captain, the captain of the USS Alliance. See, in September of the same year, the squad ended up spotting a merchant ship and attempted to pursue it, only to be blocked by the HMS Serapis. And a hired, ship known as the Countess of Scarborough, which was a merchant vessel pre-war, pre-set up for war, so that way it could be used as a volunteer for the British Navy. And this actually led to the merchant's escape, but it was this huge gunfight, and arguably one of the most noted spots in John Paul Jones's history. See, with the Serapis engaging the Bonhomme Richard and the Alliance opened fire upon the Countess, rationalizing that they wouldn't be able to take the Serapis gun to gun, John Paul Jones decided it was better to lock the ships together so they would fight on the planks and on the decks instead of just fighting from a distance. Which, even during this, there were countless wounded and tons of casualties in this, mostly on the Serapis side. But at one point, John Paul Jones was asked to surrender, and he was quoted saying, "I have not begun to fight." And upon that demand to surrender, he wouldn't, and he would eventually win this battle, so to be fair, it wasn't really a bad idea to not surrender. Mostly this victory is chalked up to the strategic placement of marksmen and marines on the decks of the ship. See, they had them up in the actual rafts and up on the top sections of the ship, shooting down, picking off anybody around, and basically just clearing the way for the deck, so that way the rest of the soldiers could fight their way across and eventually take the Serapis. Unfortunately, this was around the same time that the Alliance actually did a broadside open fire, and it did just as much damage to the Serapis as it did to the Ranger, which was kind of counterproductive. But at the same time, the Countess of Scarborough began to entice the Pallas, who was downwind of the battle, into a separate engagement, which ultimately ended in the Countess of Scarborough surrendering after the Alliance turned around and reapproached the conflict with the Countess. So, with the Bonhomme Richard burning and sinking, and some of the members wanting to surrender, thinking that their captain had died, John Paul Jones wasn't going to go down without a fight. And so he continued to pressure the assault, and when a grenade actually went off below deck near a black powder store, a massive amount of the Serapis was damaged. And this would eventually get to the point where the captain of the Serapis would surrender to John Paul Jones himself. Plus, with the Bonhomme Richard sinking and most of the crew ending up on placement upon the other ships upon the end of the battle, mostly on the Pallas and the Alliance, he was kind of left with a skeleton crew for the remainder. And so after a few days of frantic reconstruction and maintenance on the Bonhomme Richard, the Bonhomme Richard eventually sank. And so instead of, being bothered by that, he just decided, you know what? Serapis is pretty nice. I think I'll take it. And that's how he ended up with the Serapis, which he would then take to sail to an island off the coast of Holland that was neutral, known as Texel. And here's where I actually have to cut the video off. We will have a part 2 that will go into the later years of what happened after the Revolutionary War, as well as some of what happened at the end of the Revolutionary War for Mr. John Paul Jones. But in order to keep this video in the perfect time limit, I actually have to stop. And we will be doing another episode on John Paul Jones here soon. There is a whole lot else to this guy that makes him a really unique and interesting character in history, even past his exploits during the Revolutionary War. So, I've been Jay Cobley, and they don't teach that. Thanks for watching. Hey, you made it to the end of the video. Like, share, subscribe if you can. Also, remember to hit that bell notification so you don't miss out. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram so you get live notifications of when I go live. And don't forget to hit me up on YouNow. That's right. You can watch all of my episodes an hour before they premiere live on YouNow under younow.com/Jay Cobley. Thanks.